Oh my god, grab your popcorn because what just happened behind the courthouse may change everything you thought you knew about this case. The media tone has shifted. The text messages are out, the pressure is rising, and Hollywood is suddenly very quiet. Insiders are now saying this is headed straight to trial. And the fallout is spreading far beyond Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. Friendships, careers, and reputations are all on the line, and once you hear what was said outside court yesterday, you will understand why people are calling this the moment the narrative crackado. My god, grab your popcorn, settle in, wear your florals, and bring your friends. Because what we are about to walk through today is one of those moments where Hollywood completely drops the mask and shows us exactly how the game is played, and why so many people are now saying that the tide may finally be turning. Because this story is no longer just about a courtroom filing or a celebrity disagreement. It has officially spilled into public perception, media reaction, and industry whispers, and once that happens, there is no going back. Welcome to Flossom Talk. I am Jashi Floor, journalist, Hollywood truth teller, and your voice of reason in a town built entirely on illusion. And today, we are diving into what many insiders are now quietly calling a turning point for Blake Lively, because over the last 24 hours, the coverage has shifted, the tone has changed, and the questions are getting sharper following a court hearing where both sides laid out their arguments. Legal analysts, attorneys, and commentators across the spectrum are now openly saying that this case is very likely headed for trial, with a date currently set for May 18th, and that alone changes everything, because when a case is expected to go the distance, every single text, every email, every interview, and every offhand comment suddenly matters. And that is exactly where things began to unravel outside the courthouse when Blake Lively's new PR attorney Sigrid McCowie addressed reporters. And what happened in that brief exchange may end up echoing far beyond what anyone expected. Because when asked about the release of private text messages involving high-profile friends and collaborators, the response was framed as protection while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that those individuals were collateral in a much larger narrative that centered entirely on Blake. And that framing did not sit well with viewers, because what people heard was not reassurance but confirmation that friendships, reputations, and even careers were secondary to the objective of the case. And that is when the temperature shifted, because audiences are extremely sensitive to perceived imbalance when power dynamics are involved, and suddenly the question was no longer what happened on a film set, but why so many unrelated people were now being pulled into it. Through Unsealed communications, headlines began stacking one after another from multiple outlets, each one highlighting the same theme, that this was no longer contained, and that the ripple effects were spreading fast. And then came the comments about strength evidence and workplace dynamics, statements that critics immediately contrasted with deposition testimony where specific examples could not be clearly identified. And that gap between narrative and documentation became a focal point. Because in court, words are one thing, but consistency is everything, and as social media dissected every clip and quote, viewers started noticing something else. The language being used positioned Blake not as an employee navigating a workplace dispute, but as a central authority surrounded by people whose roles were framed as subordinate, and that subtle shift in phrasing sparked its own wave of discussion. Because in Hollywood, language is power, and people notice when that power shows through unintentionally. And then there was the moment that truly lit up comment sections, when a reporter pressed again about the involvement of Taylor Swift, and the answer attempted to redirect responsibility outward, which immediately clashed with months of public interviews, where Taylor had been openly referenced as a source of support during promotion. And that contradiction did not go unnoticed, because the internet has receipts, and once those receipts start circulating, the narrative becomes very difficult to control, especially when viewers feel they are being told to different stories depending on the audience. And that is when the suspense locked in. The ECAUSE people realized this was not about a single headline or even a single lawsuit. This was about credibility, and credibility, once questioned, is almost impossible to fully restore, especially in an industry built on perception. And that is only where this story begins. As the media coverage intensified, new reporting began surfacing that added even more complexity to the situation, including previously private text exchanges involving activists, industry professionals, and publicists. And while none of these messages were central to the legal claims themselves, their release had a powerful effect on public sentiment, because they painted a picture of behind-the-scenes reactions that contrasted sharply with public statements. And one of the most talked about exchanges involved a well-known feminist activist, whose private frustration over social media behavior was never intended for public consumption, and yet suddenly found its way into headlines. And that sparked a broader conversation about boundaries, relevance, and the weaponization of private communication. because viewers began asking why commentary that had no legal bearing was now part of the public record and whether its release served any purpose beyond reputational damage. And when that activist responded publicly, she framed her position clearly, stating that advocacy does not require unconditional support and that disagreement does not equal opposition. And that message resonated with a lot of people because it reflected a fatigue many feel with the expectation of automatic alignment, regardless of context, and the idea that nuance is somehow disloyal. And that moment mattered because it shifted the framing away from personality conflict and toward principle and accountability. And then the spotlight widened again as coverage turned toward co-stars whose private encouragement had now become public scrutiny, and one particular actor found himself facing backlash, not just for expressing support, but for remarks interpreted as critical of an unrelated project. And suddenly the story expanded beyond one dispute into questions about professionalism, industry loyalty, and unintended consequences. Because what is said privately often reads very differently when stripped of context and printed as a headline, and the effect was immediate, with multiple outlets highlighting how association alone can alter public perception even when intent is unclear. And that theme kept repeating as more names surfaced and more people were drawn into a narrative they never expected to be part of. And then there was the Sundance moment where an actress attempted to distance herself entirely from the conversation by claiming disconnection from online discourse, a statement that viewers immediately questioned, not because it was impossible but because of the timing and delivery. And the visible discomfort suggested less indifference and more avoidance, and that interpretation spread quickly because audiences are highly attuned to body language, tone, and hesitation, especially when stakes are high. And the more people attempted to sidestep the issue, the more it underscored just how heavy the pressure had become. Because when a case moves toward trial, silence itself becomes a strategy, and strategies invite speculation, and that speculation feeds the cycle. And suddenly what began as a legal matter had transformed into a sprawling media event where every move, every pause, and every word was analyzed in real time. And at that point there was no neutral ground left, only distance, alignment, or fallout. And viewers stayed because they could sense that each new development was setting up the next, and that something larger was still unfolding beneath the surface. What made this moment especially striking was how quickly industry sentiment appeared to shift, as opinion pieces began emerging from outlets that are not typically aligned in tone, yet suddenly echoed similar concerns about optics, behavior, and narrative consistency. And when publications with very different audiences begin drawing parallel conclusions, it signals something deeper than trend chasing. It suggests a recalibration, and one commentary in particular gained traction not because it introduced new facts, but because it articulated what many had been feeling quietly, that the public image being presented no longer matched the behind-the-scenes behavior reflected in text exchanges. And that dissonance matters because audiences can accept imperfection, but they struggle with contradiction. And as more people read through released messages, they noticed a recurring theme of influence, coordination, and reaction management that stood in contrast to claims of isolation or victimhood. And again, none of this determined legal outcome, but public trust does not operate on legal standards. It operates on perception and emotion, and those are far harder to control once momentum shifts. And then came the realization that this was no longer just about one individual, but about how systems are navigated and leveraged, because viewers began recognizing patterns that felt familiar, stories where power, resources, and connections shape narratives long before they ever reach a courtroom. And that recognition sparked engagement, because people felt they were watching a case study in real time. And each new article reinforced the idea that this situation was being evaluated, not just on facts but on fairness, proportionality, and impact. And when headlines began using words like smear campaign, opinion piece, or self-inflicted, the framing had clearly changed, and that change is often irreversible. Because once the media moves from neutral reporting to interpretive analysis, it opens the door for broader cultural critique. And suddenly the question was no longer who is right or wrong, but what does this reveal about the industry itself and how disputes are escalated, managed, and monetized. And that is when viewers leaned in, because this story stopped being about celebrities and started being about power, accountability, and consequence. And when those themes enter the conversation, audiences stay because they see themselves reflected in the dynamics, even if the setting is glamorous and the stakes are high. And the more this case unfolds, the clearer it becomes that its legacy may have less to do with a verdict and more to do with how it reshapes conversations around influence, credibility, and restraint. As we reach this point in the unfolding story, What is most apparent is that the consequences are no longer hypothetical. Reputations are being affected, relationships are being strained, and careers are being scrutinized in ways that cannot be undone. And the irony is that many of the people now facing scrutiny never sought visibility in this situation. They were pulled in through association, through support, or through private words, never intended for public eyes. And that reality has become a cautionary tale, playing out in real time, because it demonstrates how quickly private sentiment can become public currency once legal processes intersect with media attention. And when viewers watch this unfold, they are not just observing a celebrity dispute, they are watching the mechanics of exposure, how narratives expand, how alliances complicate outcomes, and how silence can sometimes speak louder than defense. And that is why engagement has remained so high, because each development feels consequential, not sensational, and because audiences understand instinctively that this is a moment that will likely be referenced long after the case itself concludes. And as the trial date approaches, the tension will only increase, because every filing, every interview, and every reaction will be viewed through the lens of inevitability. And once a story reaches that phase, the ending matters less than the impact it leaves behind, and whether lessons are learned or ignored. And that is why this moment deserves attention, not because it is dramatic, but because it is revealing. And as always, we will continue following it closely, separating reporting from opinion, and watching how truth, perception, and power collide in real time. At the end of the day, this story is no longer confined to a single allegation or a single defense. It has become a broader examination of how narratives are built, sustained, and challenged in an industry where visibility is currency and silence is strategy. What makes this moment different is that audiences are no longer passively consuming headlines. They are actively comparing statements, timelines, and behavior. And when that happens, accountability takes on a life of its own, regardless of legal outcome. The coming weeks will likely bring more filings, more commentary, and more attempts to control the narrative. But the direction of public sentiment is already in motion, and once that momentum builds, it rarely reverses entirely. Whether this case ultimately settles or goes to verdict, its impact will be felt far beyond the courtroom, because it has exposed the fragility of reputations, the risks of overreach, and the importance of consistency in a media landscape that remembers everything and forgets nothing. As always, we will continue to approach this thoughtfully, responsibly, and with a commitment to separating fact from opinion, because stories like this deserve careful attention, not blind allegiance. Thank you for being here, for engaging, and for staying curious, and we will continue this conversation as it unfolds. As this story continues to unfold, what becomes increasingly clear is that the outcome will be shaped not only by what happens inside a courtroom, but by how the public interprets everything happening outside of it. Because in cases like this, perception often runs parallel to procedure, and sometimes even faster. What began as a dispute tied to one film has now expanded into a broader conversation about influence, accountability, and the unintended consequences of dragging private conversations into the public arena. And that shift matters, because once a case enters the cultural conversation, it is no longer controlled by press statements or carefully worded filings. It is shaped by how consistent the narrative feels, and whether the actions align with the message being presented. One of the most striking aspects of this moment is how many individuals who were never central to the legal claims have suddenly found themselves under a spotlight simply because of proximity or past communication. And that reality has sparked discomfort across the industry, because it reinforces a lesson many quietly acknowledge but rarely discuss: that private loyalty can become public liability once legal strategy intersects with media exposure. And for actors, executives, activists, and creatives alike, this case is becoming a reminder that words shared in confidence can take on an entirely different meaning when viewed through the lens of litigation and public opinion. What also stands out is how quickly the media tone evolved once unsealed materials entered the conversation. The reporting shifted from surface-level summaries to deeper analysis and interpretation, and that transition signals something important, because it reflects a growing willingness to question not just actions but intent and consistency. And when multiple outlets with different editorial perspectives begin raising similar concerns, it suggests that the story has reached a threshold where scrutiny becomes unavoidable, regardless of where one stands emotionally or politically. At the same time, it is essential to acknowledge that legal outcomes are determined by evidence standards, not headlines, and that distinction cannot be overstated. Because public reaction does not equal legal judgment, and commentary does not replace due process. However, public trust operates on a different axis, one rooted in credibility, transparency, and proportionality. And when those elements feel misaligned, audiences respond accordingly. And that response can linger long after a verdict is rendered. As the anticipated trial date approaches, every new development will be magnified, and every public appearance will be interpreted through the lens of what has already been revealed. Silence will be analyzed, statements will be parsed, and even attempts to disengage will be read as strategy rather than coincidence, and that is the reality of a case that has grown beyond its original scope. Because once a narrative becomes expansive, it pulls in themes far larger than any single individual, including power dynamics, professional responsibility, and the line between advocacy and overreach. Ultimately, this moment may be remembered less for its legal resolution and more for what it exposed about the ecosystem surrounding high-profile disputes. How quickly alliances can complicate outcomes, how easily private sentiment can become public record, and how fragile reputations can be when narratives fracture under scrutiny. Whether one views this as a cautionary tale, a necessary reckoning, or simply a deeply human unraveling, the impact is undeniable, and the ripple effects are already being felt across Hollywood. As always, the most responsible way to approach a story like this is with patience, perspective, and a commitment to separating fact from interpretation, because the full picture rarely emerges all at once, and when it does, it often looks different than anyone expected. This conversation is far from over, and as more information comes forward, the focus should remain on understanding, not inflaming, on analysis, not assumption, and on accountability, without erasing nuance. And that is exactly why this story continues to matter, and why so many people are still watching closely to see what happens next.